You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Okay, good. I think we're recording. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're recording this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there. We're recording this for everyone and putting them out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
It's good. It's been a while since we've been able to do this. We had some bumps in the road, but we're
Right.
back.
Yep.
So tonight we are reviewing Star Trek: The Next Generation Season 3, Episode 7, The Enemy, which debuted on November 6, 1989, with a star date of 349.2. And this is really a Geordi-centered episode, but really it's kind of our first interaction with the Romulans. In I think this season, and I think from here on out, the show has a lot more Romulan episodes in it than previous. Before we really get into the meat of the episode, I kind of wanted to talk about the Romulans for a second. I've always thought that there's always this kind of conversation about who are certain people, who are certain communities in Star Trek analogous to in the real world, because I think a lot of people would like to think that maybe in the 80s and 90s, with its kind of liberal values and kind of internationalism, or a Western version of internationalism, I think that people would probably have looked at Starfleet as kind of like the U.S. and maybe, I don't know. They really worked hard in Star Trek: The Undiscovered Country to make the Klingons look
be
like
the Russians,
Russia.
be the Soviets, really. Yeah.
Right. So the question raises: are we clearly work with the Vulcans, and they're clearly our closest allies, it seems, in the future. Are the Romulans China? But then what does that make the Borg or the Cardassians later on? Or does that even apply to the Romulans? Because one thing that I have noticed in all the stories that we've seen where the Romulans have been depicted as the adversary or potential enemy, we've actually never seen them come into direct conflict, save for the J.J. Abrams reboot film in 2009. We're always at the edge of war with Romulans in Star Wars episodes, and with the exception of Balance of Terror in the original series, we never see the Federation actually go to battle with them. So, in many ways, I think it's interesting that the Romulans are always presented as this kind of, throughout this episode and every other episode with the Romulans, there's always this specter of war. There's always this chance that we're going to pop off and have a war with the Romulans. But at the same time, there's always these stories told about us having these potential commonalities with them. And I was just wondering if you had any sort of reflections you wanted to make on the Romulans before we got into the meat of this episode.
I think if you put it into the historical context of this being written in late 1989. Um, and
Right.
I don't know what year Undiscovered Country. What year was Undiscovered Country
Here, let me look
released?
that up.
But as you're doing that, I mean, obviously the Klingons,
1991.
all right, 91, so very, very close. And so, obviously, I think the Klingons, to put it in the context of uh, uh, the late, the late 80s, the Klingons were definitely, set up as the Soviets. China was just kind of coming out, still opening up. Yeah, they had nuclear weapons, but they, they weren't seen as a big threat like they are now. So I think that the way I think the Romulans really didn't represent anybody here. It was just throwing the fact that they're going out to the galaxy and they're running up against different species and different
Well,
political entities and so on.
can I make one argument towards the Romulan China connection, though I think that is applicable. I think during the 80s and 90s, and even today, from a Western perspective, there is a certain sense of closed offness when it comes to the actual Chinese culture on the ground in terms of what their political and social culture is, in terms of what their lived experience is on the ground in China versus what we live here in the West. I don't think that we as Westerners have a real understanding about what the day-to-day existence is like for the common person in a place like Beijing or Shanghai. I think in many ways the Romulans have always been presented as this very closed-off society, and in many ways xenophobic. Um, in many ways, you know a lot of Chinese culture, if you look at their educational practices in terms of how we're depicted, there are many cases where they have xenophobic tendencies towards us in terms of how they're how we're culturally depicted in their educational practices and their educational materials. You see the same thing happening in places like North Korea, where we're the great devil of the world according to the North Koreans. In Chinese education, we have they look at us a little similarly, like we're capitalists who kind of have corruption and all these other things to deal with. But I think that the Romulans and the Chinese share this kind of similar closed offness or perception from Westerners of being closed off.
I really don't see that because I think it's one of the things where the Federation has, gone out even back to the original series years back before, the Enterprise D, that they're just starting to bump up. They bumped up against the Romulan Star Empire for maybe 100 years now, but they really haven't gotten into it. There's been threats and feeling out and so
Well, they
forth.
have a
So
neutral zone.
yeah, yeah. So and the thing about I don't know how. I mean, our political. I think the average American view of China, which is all the hell over the place, because a lot of Americans don't
Right.
even couldn't find China on the fucking globe.
Well,
Um,
to be fair, I think most Americans now can find China on a globe. I think if you ask them to find a place like Afghanistan or
but
Iraq or
but I
Saudi
I think
Arabia,
I think that they have a very I wonder I don't know if you can define an average American attitude toward China. It's all over the place. Where the Chinese, there's probably some Chinese people having been there that are open minded, and they probably have to hide it because of they're passively resisting the communist control. But there's probably more and more people in China that are succumbing to the constant nationalistic message because the Communist Party, really wants to be in control of everything with all of the monitoring they do of people, what they watch on the internet, what they watch on television, who they're talking to on their smartphones,
oh well,
etc.
they've completely closed off the internet in certain cities now.
Huh.
So like I think when it comes to us, I think in many ways, I mean, this is in some ways the Orwell conversation. Um, what happens when you have a society that is planned in a central fashion down to like what people think and feel? What are the real ramifications of that? I think we in the West have no perception of what the actual toll of that is, because China has had this social credit system that they actually use and monitor now, for about 5 years, I think, and it is starting to have profound impacts over here as well, in terms of certain social media sites are starting to develop their own social credit systems, and they take that from the Chinese model in terms of like being able to determine, in China they kind of determine quote unquote who's a good person, who's a bad person. But here in the West, they you can use that technology or that practice to determine like who's a bad actor and who's a good actor in a varying array of scenarios. But then that gets into the difficult question of like, okay, what's our actual definition of like a good actor versus what's our definition of a bad actor? If someone's a political dissident, the Chinese government looks at them as a bad actor. But if you're a political dissident against Facebook or Google or Twitter, are you a good actor or a bad actor?
Right.
You suddenly get into a very murky place.
Right.
I don't think that the Romulans, however, presented in necessarily a murky fashion. They're it always seems that like the writing around them is very aggressive.
Hmm.
So let's get into the actual show real quick.
Sure. Sure. Good.
Um, the USS Enterprise D has intercepted a distress call from a craft within the neutral zone, and Captain Picard chooses to set aside Federation diplomatic policy and respond to it. Just when the Enterprise is about to reach the vessel, the it crash lands on a planet inside Federation territory known as Galorndon Core. Powerful electromagnetic storms on the surface are obscuring all scans, and Picard orders down an away team that includes Riker, LaForge, and Worf. Um, Great care is being taken to maintain a transporter lock on them, and when they get down there, the electromagnetic charged atmosphere is so combustible and so harmful that not only do their comm badges cease to function, but their tricorder scans are severely limited. Based on the markings of a ship that they find, Worf and Riker conclude that they have indeed found a Romulan vessel. The group splits up to investigate the area, looking for a Romulan survivor, and unfortunately, Geordi LaForge falls into a large chasm and is cut off from the rest of the away team, who has to beam back up. Worf and Riker return. Uh, Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. Worf, along the way, locates a Romulan survivor who is alive enough to feebly attack him. Worf incapacitates him, and he and Commander Riker bring this prisoner back to the beam outside, unfortunately leaving behind Geordi LaForge, who is stranded on the planet. When they get up there, when the away team and the wounded Romulan are returned to the ship, they immediately whisk the Romulan off the sickbay, where Dr. Crusher determines that he will need a ribosome refusion or he will die. The Romulan's name is Patak, of all things, which I found interesting because Patak is, of course, a Klingon pejorative, and here we
Really?
have a
My.
Romulan named Patak. So
Right. Right.
I was like, huh.
Yes.
Uh,
Huh.
and I saw the spelling of this on Memory Alpha, and it's like, no, it's spelled Patak. Like, there's no other way to pronounce it.
So this is sort
Um,
of an inside joke, I guess.
I guess a little bit. So,
Yeah.
we have the story kicking off in Galundon Core, which One thing that I want to speak to about these episodes, especially in season 3, that I think are getting better, the settings are so rich in certain episodes. Like, the London core has a real character and element to it, like the mud, the rain, kind of the dark stone and the lightning flashing, the mist and everything, just the wind.
Sure.
Um, it's a lot of simple stuff, but the setting itself is just gorgeous, I think. And LeVar Burton, and I wanted to get the other actor's name who plays Centurion Bakra, because he's really great in this. John Snyder. John Snyder plays Centurion Bakra. Um, the work that they do in like the mud and the wet in this episode is really great stuff.
Hmm.
And I just really want to take a moment and talk about how great the actual staging and setting of the episode is.
Yeah,
I also thought the lighting was really good for like
yeah,
10 for
I I
everything.
like that because at one point when Geordi, I thought it was very interesting how he was able to make those hand spikes to get out of the pit, and then when he was before Bakra found him, and he's crawling along that kind of embankment in the rain, and he's slipping and so forth and sliding. You could just feel how
Right,
nasty and cold it must have been. His feet are falling into the water and so forth. It was a very,
right.
the scenery and the setting and so forth, the lightning, the horrible weather was very good. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I really love about the show sometimes is the physical travails that they'll actually put the characters through, and they'll actually put the characters through like scuffing them up and getting them dirty and everything.
Right.
Um, I remember from the original series there were, especially the episode with Kirk fighting the Gorn.
Mm.
A lot of those original series episodes are really rough and tumble,
Hmm.
and this one is too. One thing that I noticed, so I know you haven't watched Discovery yet, but one thing that they do in Discovery is that all the away teams now go down in like spacesuits. Essentially, they're in protective suits. I think that if the show were made today, um, an away team would never go down to a surface like this without some sort of protective suit on. It seems kind of crazy that they sent them down kind of barefaced with no coverings
Is this
in
is
this kind
this
of windy, nasty environment.
is this a post pandemic thing? Like they've maybe we should. I wonder if that had any effect on people's thinking.
No, no. Discovery was doing that before the pandemic. I think that I think one thing that Star Trek is going to try to do with the new shows that are going to be coming out is that they're going to try to adhere somewhat to a more scientific basis. So, like, you won't see away teams just beaming down to the surface of a planet anymore without, a spacesuit on or something to protect them. I think that they'll actually spend time, like, taking scans of the surface and, like, determining can we really breathe down there? Something that I think Enterprise did really well. Enterprise did a lot of work, especially in those first couple of seasons. Like if they went to a new planet, Archer was often in a suit, or the crew were often in a suit, and they had the entire decontamination unit. There's no decontamination unit anymore in the 24th century, but I think it's one of those things that is being more it is being considered more and more when it comes to the new Trek shows being
Hmm.
produced.
Hmm.
But one thing that I find interesting, you brought up the scene with Geordi creating those spikes. I have to say it's the one scene of the entire episode that kind of threw me out of the episode or threw me out of the story because it on from a storytelling perspective, and I think from a perspective of a director behind a camera, it's a very good scene because you see Geordi or LeVar Burton using Geordi's visor to like obviously see something in this muddy hill, and he picks out these metal rocks that he washes in the water, and then he uses his phaser and kind of like melts them down and forges these spikes, but there's no real explanation of what he's doing. And I think the actual so, I'm a sword collector and I know how things can be made, even in, rough terrain like that. It's such a silly scene that I don't know, it just throws me out. And the spikes themselves, if it's so muddy, it just seems, I don't know. I might be nitpicking here, but it's the one scene of the entire episode that I thought did not fit.
I think you got good points in terms of, taking whatever the ore was or close to pure metal out of the rock and then melting it down into the little, um, you know, um, form that he had created in sort of like the very clay-like soil. But um, I think you're nitpicking some, but your nitpicking is probably justified.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, well, thank you. So let moving on. Let's go back up to the ship real quick. So the captured Romulan is taken back to the Enterprise and needs a transfusion of compatible ribosomes to save his life. It turns out that Worf is the only person aboard that can act as a donor because humanoids share comparable. Apparently, we share comparable ribosome structures.
Ribosome, antigen, something like that. Yeah. I can't remember exactly what they said.
Yes. Yes, as it turns out, Worf has the compatible ribosomes needed, citing his parents. But, okay, so Crusher finds out that Worf has the compatible ribosomes needed to save this Romulan who's dying in her sick bay. And she calls Worf to her office and says, explains to him what's going on. And Worf balks because Romulans, of course, were the aggressors that killed his parents at the Battle of Kittimer, or the raid on Kittimer, where the House of Duras, of course, betrayed the Romulan Empire and sided with the Romulans, which of course led to Worf being dishonored and his house being in discommodation. A lot of things happened. Um, what do you think of Worf's reaction here? I want to ask you this first because there's a little bit of backstory to what the writers decided to do with the character here. But what do you think of Worf saying no to um, Crusher's request for him to donate the ribosomes needed to save this Romulan, and his ultimate reasoning behind it?
It, Worf being a Klingon and very much into honor and, really having a lot of issues, for lack of a better term, about how his parents died and how he became an orphan. He is not able to forgive the Romulans, for what happened. Thus, he is not going to voluntarily make the donation. Um,
Hmm.
it gets a little complicated. I mean, it's an interesting discussion because one, there's a discussion between Riker and Worf saying,
Right.
bringing up that, well, look, suppose 50 or 100 years from now, there's a treaty between the Romulans and the Federation, and we're kind of at peace with each other or allies, just like the Federation went to war with the Klingon Empire, and now we're allies. So things change.
Multiple times. Yes.
And then the other interesting thing is, the respect for personal choice, which in 1989 it probably didn't relate to. I don't know whether it related to the whole abortion discussion that had started back then, but I actually appreciated um, Picard trying to convince Worf
Hmm.
to make the donation, but Worf, being a good Starfleet officer and loyal to Picard, said, "If you order me, I will do that." And
Yes.
Picard was not willing to do that. He respected Um, he respected, Worf's decision that he did not want to donate. And then what the kicker, what really was the icing, is when Crusher has Worf come to see the Klingon, and
Okay,
his,
the Romulan.
I'm
I
sorry,
have to stop you here because I
yeah,
have a question that I want to ask you directly about this scene.
sure, sure, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, thank you for bringing up his conversation with Picard because I think you're right. It's very good that Picard doesn't force him to make a decision,
Right.
but he also has that conversation with Riker. Um Riker's so I want to bring up like both of their arguments that Picard and Riker make towards Worf so I can ask you this question. Um Picard's argument is like, a Starfleet officer basically has to put aside their prejudices and do the right thing. I am begging you as a Starfleet officer to put aside your prejudices and do the right thing. And Worf, as you say, Worf says, if you order me as a Starfleet officer, I will do it, but as a Klingon, I am refusing. Riker's argument is like, look, 50 to 100 years ago, wouldn't we be in the same place with you refusing to give me the compatible ribosomes? So Crusher does bring Worf to sickbay to see the Romulan, and he and the Romulan have this interaction where Worf looks down at Romulan and says, "I've been told that there is something in my body that can save your life, and that it's my decision whether or not you live or die." And the Romulan looks up at him and says, "I would rather die than have Klingon filth in my veins." So, this is the question I want to ask. It's very clear with the Romulan's reaction to Worf when Worf says, "I can save your life," that, and this kind of gets back to my point about, the xenophobia of the Romulans. The Romulans are clearly racist towards Klingons. The idea of them having Klingon blood in them, even from a donor to save their life, like for this Klingon Patak, for this Romulan Patak, um, this, like, as far as I'm concerned, he kind of makes a little bit of a racist statement based on Worf's, he sees an impurity in Worf's genetics. Is Worf's decision not to save the Romulan based on racism or hatred of the Romulans, or is there a separation between the two? Like, does Worf have is Worf have is Worf's bias racial against the Romulans? Because I think it says something about the Federation of the philosophy of the Federation versus maybe the culture of the Klingons.
Well, you get into the cultural issue, and there's been things we've heard before, or things, maybe this is after this episode, but we know that the Romulans have believed themselves to be superior to other people in
Right.
the galaxy. So
Genetically, yes.
yeah, so there is there's a built-in cultural attitude where the Romulan Patak says to Worf, I don't want your filth in my body. And I think
Right.
that then shifts over to Worf, where, I think his decision to not be a donor is more personal as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
racial. And this guy, because of what he says, he totally insults Worf, because Worf is actually, not being hostile to him, says, I understand. It's like Worf is thinking through this almost one last time. So he goes to see the Romulan and says, is basically saying, I have the potential to help you. And what would have happened if the Romulan said, I really appreciate that if you could do that? Worf doesn't get that. He gets it thrown right back in his face, so that
That
all the
that's a fair
personal
point.
negative feelings that Worf has is just reinforced by the Romulan being a total asshole to Worf. So
Right. And you know what?
I really see the Romulan being racial. I don't see Worf being racial here. I'm saying that Worf's feelings are total personal.
So, do you know what? Thank you. That is the exact answer I was looking for, and that that perfectly addresses the question I was looking to pose. Because one thing, one thing that I think this demonstrates, um, I think that there is a wall of humanity versus the cultural separation between Klingons and Romulans taking place that we're not seeing here, where for Picard, Riker, and Beverly Crusher, the idea of not trying to save another life, whether it was Romulan or a Klingon or a Talarian or an Andorian, for these human Starfleet officers, and really kind of for our species, the human race, at least in terms of how it's depicted in Star Trek, humans do kind of have this. I guess we have this ethos or mission to try to save others, or even if they're not of our species. But it seems in Star Trek, it's often written that it took Archer, a human, showing Shran that he could trust Vulcans before the Vulcans and the Andorians would actually work with each other. Um, the Klingons and the Klingons and the Romulans clearly have a long-standing, almost genetic feud with each other that is kind of at play here culturally between Worf and this Romulan Patak. I think that there's something very interesting to discuss here about what happens when we have our human ethos run up against the cultural
I can
disagreements between
I can
other
tell you.
species.
I can tell you from a very practical experience that I'm aware of, and that's
Okay.
Israeli medicine, particularly ophthalmologist, versus Palestinian ophthalmologist. And I know a number of Israeli Jewish ophthalmologists who
Mm-hmm.
stay in very good contact with um, uh, Palestinian ophthalmologists either in Gaza and the West Bank, and they'll collaborate and educate each other on new surgical techniques or medical treatments and so on. I'm sure there are Israeli ophthalmologists and physicians who are racist, to use that term, and have no use for the Arabs at all and won't do anything with them. But there are many Israeli ophthalmologists that will be supportive and helpful to their
Mm-hmm.
Palestinian colleagues. Now, to take it a step further, one thing when I was reviewing these notes today, I thought about this, and this has really happened. I don't know how recently, but on several occasions, you've had a Palestinian or Israeli child or teenager that's injured and they become
Mm-hmm.
brain dead. So they qualify for organ donation. And consent is given to the family to recover the organs. And the organs, specifically in terms of the matching system and the local need, is Israeli organs. An Israeli organ may end up in a Palestinian, or vice versa. A Palestinian organ may end up in an Israeli. And
Mm-hmm.
you've got this political and cultural animosity between these two groups in this very small geographic area. But when it comes to helping somebody else and actually saving someone else's life, those uh, those barriers can come down. And
Right.
I think that was sort of the point that you know Riker was trying to make to Worf, to put it into perspective how things could change.
Right.
And I don't know how often this sort of thing happens between Israeli, organ donation from a Palestinian donor to an Israeli patient or vice versa. But, as it happens, it does build some bridges between people and so on.
Well, stepping away
And,
from the
and
show and
you can say the same thing here, that if you have, an African American receives a kidney from
oh
um,
yeah.
a white American, or a white American, a non-Hispanic organ goes into an American Hispanic patient, then if there could be some cultural or racial animosities that are going to have to be broken down or have to be dealt with, because it's all
Well,
based upon you donate the organ to save somebody else's life. You don't necessarily know who is going to get that organ unless there's directed donation, which is not that often, really.
well, I think one thing that this episode might be speaking to, and what you're speaking to here, is that in today's world, when you finally get into the situation where people are donating organs and saving the lives of other people, these cultural and religious and racial or gender or whatever sort of barriers between people break down because there is now an investment made on both sides to the general welfare of the human being. Um, I think in the 24th century, I think there's real shock that Picard and Crusher and Riker show when Worf says no. Because by the 24th century, the idea of not donating something or not being a service to your fellow living being is probably something that is just so out there. Like the entire situation that we have with Israel and Palestine is probably just such a footnote in history in the 24th century that anyone that looks back on it probably looks at it and goes like, how are people acting this way in the first place? But kind of taking a steps outside of the show, one thing that American media does, and I hope, Ben, you're listening to this because I hope it's different by the time you're older and you can appreciate this. But one thing that American media has really done is painted the idea that Israel is just this kind of monolithic culture where everyone sees things this one way in terms of, you know, the formation of Jewish state and who has the right to Israel and Palestine and who has the right to Gaza and the Temple on the Mount and Jerusalem and all that. The truth is that there's a lot of varied and different opinions in Israel and in Palestine about how you achieve a two-state solution. If there is a two-state solution, because, for the longest time currently, the ruling party has been the hyper-conservative Likud party, which simply believes that Israel is supposed to be a Jewish ethno state. Now, there's a lot of people in Israel who are Jewish and Arab who feel like that is not the case at all, that Israel can be a multicultural center of the world, as it always has been throughout history. And, it's just people can change and have different views and opinions and perceptions. And like like your pop or your grandfather is noting, a lot of people have gone through these kind of situations where they have had to put their lives on the line for each other in a way, or give each other a certain measure of humanity that they usually don't have to give on a daily basis, and they find these commonalities.
Hmm.
Do you want to add anything to that, Dad, or am I
Yeah.
off kilter? Or
No, I think that, one of the things that just become very normal, I don't know what percentage of the American public routinely donates blood, but
oh, right.
you don't hear too many, unless they're Jehovah's Witness or something like that. You don't hear of any stories where if a patient, regardless of their race, religion, um, know that they're going to refuse a blood transfusion. You know,
Do you know what? I will have to say, since this is 2021, I don't hear any stories of people refusing organs or blood transfusions, but we have gotten to the place where people refuse the vaccine because of COVID-19.
yeah, but
Even in
that's
the hospital.
a little. You're not dealing with human tissue per se. It's a little
No,
different.
I know, but like, I think the entire idea of, I think when, well, let's not get into that. Let's
Yeah,
let's move
it's
on to something
right,
else.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, So, going back down to the planet for a second, the radiation is so bad down there, it's actually causing this neural degradation. that is affecting Geordi not only physically but also in terms of his visor. Along the way, however, he runs magically into another Vulcan named Bakra, and he and
No,
Bakra actually
another
become
Romulan.
another
We're
Romulan. What
we're
did I
both doing
say?
this. We're using Romulan in Klingon and Romulan interchangeably, sort of like no,
Sorry, he
they're two
run
different species here.
he runs into a another Romulan named Centurion Bakra, who was one of the two Romulans that crashed on Galundon Core in that Romulan craft that was in the neutral zone. Through their, and I think without getting deep into the nitty gritty of everything that happens between Bakra and Geordi, I think that the story between them is actually demonstrating what you're talking about.
It
Um,
does, yes.
Geordi and Bakra have to struggle together to survive, to reach, this kind of neutrino beacon that Wesley Crusher has ingeniously sent down to the planet. You asked a question about
How the
how did
hell does
Geordi know?
know that it's Wesley who came up with the neutrino pulse beam?
Dad, Dad, I have no idea, but I do want to. So here's the thing, and I wanted to see if you notice it as we keep watching season 3. But there's going to be times where like Wesley Crusher does something, and only Geordi LaForge is the one that picks up on it later on, where he
Hmm.
goes, "Ah, Wesley Crusher." Like every time Geordi LaForge is stuck, Wesley Crusher's going to do something, and Geordi LaForge will realize it's him. I think that this is one of those times. Um, but I think the story of Bakra and Geordi is really the one that we're talking about. When you actually have to put, mutual sacrifice into not only surviving but actually coming to an understanding to be able to work together. I think a lot of these cultural boundaries and a lot of these kind of species boundaries, as we see between Geordi and Bakra, they really do kind of fall apart. And it does make me wonder, the story of them coming together in mutual survival is held up against the story of kind of the geopolitical ramifications of the neutral zone, where you've had the ship that was this Romulan ship that wasn't where it was supposed to be crash land on a Federation planet, and it's very clear that the Romulans and the Federation have had this de facto ceasefire for a long time, ever since the Balance of Terror, which is a Star Trek: The Original Series episode that everyone should go watch. It's in the first season. It's great. Um, but there's this immediate worry that once the Romulans cross the neutral zone, any interaction is probably going to end up with the Federation going to war. Um, with this being cast in 1989 and with you growing up the way you did in America with the tensions we had with the Russians, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but with the constant tension of us potentially going to war with someone through most of your adult life, um, what do you think of this storyline, and what do you think of the tension between Picard and Tomalak, or the Federation and the Romulans?
I think that
Both from like 1980, the perspective you
right.
might have had in 1989, and the perspective you have now.
I think that part of the episode with the communication discussion between Picard and Commander Tomalak is it's all a lesson in what brinksmanship is. And as Picard said,
Yes,
it's a very dangerous game. And as you said, that there's the expectation that now that the Romulans have entered the neutral zone and they're actually in Federation space, then we've got to stand up to them and get the phasers
right.
ready, get the photon torpedoes loaded, and so forth. And it's sort of like what happened in the 80s once Gorbachev became the head of the Soviet Union and Ronald Reagan was president. One of the things that happened there, if you look historically, is that there was a tremendous increase in military spending by the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, one of the things that may have really happened there is there was a realization that the Soviet Union was economically weak, and that if we upped the game of the arms race and worked out spend them and they would try to catch up, it would just put a lot of pressure on them economically. And and there was brinksmanship going on because Gorbachev and the Soviets were interested in looking at arms reduction, arms control. One of the big
Mm-hmm.
things was intermediate range ballistic missiles, where we came up with a mobile missile that we had
Mm-hmm.
based in Germany called the Pershing missile that was put on a mobile launcher. They actually, the Americans, they still use them, probably the old SS German Army caserns, the Army forts. They would base them there, and then they drive out for a couple of days and drive them around the southern Germany countryside so that the Soviets wouldn't know where they were. And I know from somebody we know that was a guard on them that they actually had something called dial yield, so that you could actually,
Mm-hmm.
limit the size of the nuclear explosion if you just wanted to take out, a division of Soviet tanks coming through the full gap, or if you wanted to really increase the yield and take out a medium-sized, German or Polish city, which is a transportation hub, boom, you could do it. And those
Mm-hmm.
intermediate range ballistic missiles were of concern to the Soviets because, they could reach Russian soil in a very short period of time. So again, it became a bargaining chip. It part of the whole brinksmanship game to try to, counter what the Soviets were doing. And I think what Reagan ultimately wanted to do and had some success is, I don't know whether to start one or start two, but strategic arms limitation treaty. It actually
Yeah.
worked to some extent. And in the long run, by spending so much money and the Soviets trying to kept up, it did contribute to the demise of the Soviet Union.
Well, I think one thing that it also it did in a way was push us technologically forward in a sense that, you know, we spent so much time building the Soviets up as a cultural enemy and using them as such motivation to push us in terms of a technological innovation that post I would argue that post the fall of the Berlin Wall, we have not been as motivated to innovate and improve our material surroundings or our material abilities as much as we were when we had the Soviets to compete with.
You're talking about military material or what?
I'm talking everything, technology, culturally, going back to Gorbachev, Gorbachev was trying to not only reform economically and militarily, he was also trying to reform culturally after Stalin. Because, Khrushchev came in and didn't really do much to change what Stalin did culturally. Khrushchev kind of just co opted it and was a little bit more weak and corrupt than Stalin was. But every kind of Russian premier after Stalin um, didn't do the necessary cultural shifts to kind of liberalize the country, and Gorbachev tried at the last moment to do as much as he could without getting rid of communism completely. And as we saw, it all fell apart because he just couldn't keep the system up. But I think one of the things that when we talk about how we outspent them in terms of the arms race, a large part of our outspending in terms of the arms race was just basic research and development. Like there
Well,
were things that we,
yeah, you had
yeah, sorry, go.
Star Wars, which was
Well, not even
the development of the anti missile system.
Star Wars. Certain aircraft, like we came up with the F-22, the FA-18, um,
They didn't come on until into this century, though. They really
No,
didn't.
but the F-22 came on in the 90s.
You'd have to look that up.
No, I, I'm sure about this one.
Okay, all
Um,
right.
but a lot of the stuff that we did, and a lot of the stuff technologically, especially computers, a lot of the stuff that we pushed because of the internet happened because we were trying to compete with the Soviets, who were developing their own kind of internet system at the same time. A lot of what we did, I would argue, was in large part competition to.
Oh well, it's
Um,
yeah. I mean, I mean, military technology competition continues to this day because I'm glad we kind of touched on this. Is that the Star Wars initiative, was really a threat to the Soviets. Also, they didn't know how advanced we were because if you could,
hey,
you
Dad,
know,
can I pause for a second?
sure,
So,
okay.
sorry, go ahead.
What I was going to say is, I think the Star Wars anti ballistic missile technology was actually threatening to the Soviets and part of the brinksmanship because,
Mhm.
if you could put up a working missile defense that could really take down a number of incoming Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles or nuclear missiles, then, it started to break down the whole mutually assured destruction. And
Right.
I mean, talking about military expenditures and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of competition between us and China and the Russians about using artificial intelligence in military. And now the big thing is hypersonic missiles. I mean,
I'm glad
that's
you brought that up.
which is really scary because if these are going at 6,500 miles per hour, right now the technology is such they move so fast. There's no way that you could develop a missile system to knock them
Well, did you
down.
hear about the recent report from the Chinese testing of their hypersonic missile?
Yes,
So they recently tested a missile in August
or
that
July actually. I heard it
I
was July.
the report that I read said August, like it
Yeah.
was this past August.
I heard a report said that they actually tested it in July, and then we didn't find out about it till several months later, which kind of said, "Hey, look, we can do." The Chinese said we can do stuff that you don't even know about,
Correct.
which is scares us even more.
Well, this is off the back of Russia reporting that they had been researching a hypersonic missile and been testing one out for a
Right,
while as
and
well.
and we're doing
Um,
it also.
well, it's interesting because in Star Trek, the brinksmanship is really over the control of the neutral zone, who's able to control that territory. But it's funny because the Romulans already have kind of a key piece of technology that gives them a leg up. They have their cloaking device. Unless the Federation has developed some sort of way to detect the Romulan cloaking device, which I don't think has been discerned or revealed in this episode, um, it seems like their brinksmanship is always over this very strategic strip of space between their two territories. And in some ways, it's an interesting artificial stand-in for nuclear weapons or mutually assured destruction. Because what do the Romulans and the Federation have besides fleets of starships between each other?
I mean, if they go to war, there's going to be a lot of destruction. I mean,
Right,
there was mention of when Riker and Worf were having the discussion. He mentioned that millions of people died in the Klingon Federation wars.
right. Well, one thing that was mentioned during Balance of Terror, the original series episode. Uh, the premise of that episode is that the crew of the original Enterprise runs into a Romulan ship for the first time after a previous Earth Romulan war during Archer's era. And one thing that Spock informs the crew about is that the weapons used during the Earth Romulan War were nuclear weapons and were relatively crude compared to the weapons that they were using and balance of power, and of course would be extremely crude to the weapons that the Enterprise D would be using against Tomalak and his Warbird. But I think the point that's trying to be made here is that there's an inherent understanding by both sides that if the Federation and the Romulans go to war, it is automatically going to be destructive on a level that is, I guess, losing for both sides. Where I don't think that this is necessarily the same case with like the Klingons. It seems like when we talk about the Klingon Empire, at least in the Next Generation, their alliance with the Federation really does buffer them from having to worry about things like wars with the Romulans or wars with the Cardassians, which we don't see later on until Deep Space Nine. But for
Hmm.
right now in the Next Generation, it really seems like when it comes to like the interstellar politics of the time, the Klingons and the Federation's alliance really does kind of buffer the Klingons more than it does the actual Federation itself. Like
It helps the Klingons more than the Federation.
yeah, well, it keeps the Klingons away from the war, where it
Yeah,
seems like if there is going to be a war between the Romulans and someone else, it's immediately going to be the humans. It won't be the Klingons, which is an interesting place to be because there's real anonymity between the Romulans and the Klingons on a very like we don't like each other
right,
basis.
right.
Um I wonder if, one thing that I find interesting about brinksmanship, and it's something that Picard says about, kind of the risk of all this in case Galund and Core does become something akin to Pearl Harbor or an event that he references called Salem 1, which I looked up and couldn't find anything about. I think it's just something they wrote in world.
Hmm.
Um, but you know, for your generation, Pearl Harbor means something far different than it does for my generation. And I was just wondering if you could give context for Ben and the listeners at home. When Picard says Pearl Harbor, what did that mean to you?
I'd rather than comment my generation, I'd rather comment on my parents' generation, your
Well,
grandparents.
Granddaddy fought that war, but like you were the ones that immediately lived afterwards and had to live with the story and the effects of it.
Um, it
Like, what was the story that you were told about Pearl Harbor?
I mean, the story was, I can remember when I was 7 years old and started, and we heard all of the, saw things on television about World War II and things like that. That it was a heinous surprise attack by the Japanese that brought America into World War II, and it was such a for the people that were alive and had to go to war back in 1941 and into 42 through 44, 45, that it was so life changing for them that you know when I was growing up, there was still that sense of how um, impactful that day was.
Hmm.
Um, and September 11th is compared to Pearl Harbor, and I don't know,
Yes.
and the thing is, I don't know if I really don't think 9/11. It's had tremendous effect. It's probably had as much as effect in changing our world as Pearl Harbor did. But one of the important differences is, and this has been talked about, is after Pearl Harbor and we went to war against the Axis powers, everybody
Hmm.
was in it. I mean, even civilians, there were people who, everybody had gas rationing, they had meat rationing,
Right. There you
they
go.
had
Yeah.
people that were
Everyone was economically invested.
right. I mean, it changed. Hitler, you know, changed gender politics because that was when women were needed to work in the arms factories and, learn
Yeah.
how to be riveters to make the tail sections for B-26s and so on. And after 9/11, you know, a number of people volunteered, enlisted, and they went to Afghanistan. And then, of course, a couple of years later, they went to Iraq. Um, but no one really had to give anything up. There was the trauma of 9/11, but there wasn't this collective, everybody, we didn't go to war with other nations. We went to war with Al Qaeda, which was kind of this amorphous group. So, I think the impact of 9/11 on our world is just as great as Pearl Harbor was to get the U.S. involved in World War II. But the I think that there was a lot more national involvement in after Pearl Harbor as opposed to 9/11 because everybody had to put skin in the game. Not everybody really had to put skin in the game after 9/11.
May I push back on the 9/11 thing for a
Sure,
second?
sure.
I don't disagree with you that Pearl Harbor was a big event, but I think the bigger world-changing event was probably Hiroshima and Nagasaki in terms of like what really changed the world on a titanic level. I think Pearl Harbor historically is a very large event because it definitely is kicking off the American involvement in World War II and also, economically kicking off really the true recovery and the asserting of American economic dominance for the
It it
next.
it, it ended the depression. And your comment
Yes.
about the atomic bombs, yeah, I think they have tremendous impact in the world. But when I was talking about Pearl Harbor 9/11, I was talking about it specifically
Right.
from the impact on American thinking, the American
Well,
psyche. I think that
well,
the
one thing that we
bombs.
didn't do in 9/11. Well, one thing that we didn't do in 9/11 that I think that we still um that they did do at um Pearl Harbor, and you said something about the collective trauma of Pearl Harbor and the collective trauma of 9/11. Um, th- American society got to deal with the collective trauma of Pearl Harbor because, like, they showed the sunken ships on TV. They showed the dead bodies. They showed the burials. They showed the cleanup efforts. They showed people on the ground.
You're talking about Pearl
Um,
Harbor or you're talking 9/11?
yes, Pearl Harbor. No,
No,
Pearl Harbor.
yeah, but people didn't. There wasn't television then.
Yes, there was. There was tons of.
No, 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 no.
It was
There was not regular
Dad,
television
I've
in
seen the
1940,
newsreels.
but there were newsreels
The
that people would
newsreels
see in
that
the.
they were showing, that was the television of the time.
Well, you have to define that because people did not have television sets in 1941. I got a leg
Anyway,
cramp. I got to stand up. Go ahead.
anyway, um, after 9/11, we showed the pictures of like people cleaning up at the World Trade Center. We showed pictures of George W. Bush going down to the World Trade Center, but we never showed the pictures of people like really cleaning up after the side of the Twin Towers. We didn't show the people dying from exposure from the burn pits, having to deal with jet fuel from the fallout. This is something that Jon Stewart's talking about recently. Um,
Mm.
and I think a lot of that is because American media after Vietnam, after showing all of those people being carted out in coffins on TV, I think that we as a country are very hesitant to actually deal with the collective trauma because if you actually have to deal with it and look at it head on, it becomes very hard to do things like send people to war, get people to involve themselves in conflict, or even get themselves involved in a certain jingoistic level of patriotism.
Well, I think that 9/11 was much more personal because a lot of people watched it live.
Well,
And I think that afterwards, it was immediate. In the evening news, you saw people, NBC News and so forth, CNN, right down where the dust was still settling in Lower Manhattan. And I think that it was in some many ways, 9/11 was much more personal, just because we had electronic media, available much more than we did in 1941.
you know what? I have to. This is going to be a very unpopular opinion, and who knows how this is going to sound when someone finally listens to it months or years down the road when this episode
Right,
gets out. Um, Colin Powell just died yesterday.
right.
It's 10/19/2021, Ben. Colin Powell was a general in the United States Army and a former Secretary of State, the first black Secretary of State. Was it under George H.W. Bush?
No, he was Secretary of State under George W. Bush, and then he was
Right,
chairman of the Joint Chiefs under George H.W. Bush during Gulf War One.
right, right. He was Joint Chiefs of Staff under
Right,
H.W. Bush. I'm
right.
sorry. I
Yeah,
I knew that he had a cabinet position like before he was Secretary of State.
right.
Um, so Colin Powell just died, and Colin Powell has, a very respected, lauded career in terms of his service to the United States, but he was also involved in getting us into the Iraq War, which, depending on who you talk to and the view you take on it, we may have gotten into it because of erroneous means and reasonings that Powell was involved in, especially when it came to the presentation of anthrax in front of the UN. Um,
Well, weapons of mass destruction in general. Yeah,
right, but he held up the famous pictures of him holding up a vial of
right,
anthrax
right.
and saying like this amount of anthrax can kill this many people in a
Oh yeah,
room.
right.
And for a while we actually had a male scare because of it.
We
There's
had
a
a
word that terrorists.
we had a mail scare for anthrax right after 9/11.
Right. Well, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, right.
That continued all the way into the
Yes.
justification of the Iraq War because we were going after Al Qaeda. Um, if we talk about the fallout of 9/11 and we talk about the way it's portrayed now, Netflix just put out this kind of documentary about the day it happened and how everyone came together. And if you look at the people who are interviewed in it, it's Dick Cheney and it's George W. Bush and it's Condoleezza Rice, and they're all telling this story of kind of like this kind of heroic story that they're all involved in terms of like getting New York back together and standing up to the terrorists. But if you know we knew that Al Qaeda was planning an attack on American soil well before 9/11. We knew that Al Qaeda was in Pakistan, not Iraq. We knew that if there was a war to be fought, it was going
and
to
that
be
and
in
that Al Qaeda
Afghanistan.
was in Afghanistan also. Right.
Yes, yes. For a little bit, they weren't there for very long.
Correct. True.
And once we got in Afghanistan and got them out, we dealt with a lot of more. We dealt with a lot of other problems that weren't Al Qaeda. Um,
Yes.
but the point I'm trying to make is that I think one of the reasons why we don't, Pearl Harbor, even in today's American psyche, is looked at this point where like America rose up, and that's where like the heroes of a generation were born, and all these other things. I don't think that we have that with 9/11 because the true trauma of 9/11 still hasn't been dealt with. And it still hasn't been dealt with because I think just like Vietnam and us not talking about Vietnam in an honest way, we're not talking about the fallout of 9/11 in an honest way. And I think it's very hard to get the same kind of patriotic or nationalistic
I
feeling
I have to
behind it like you could with Pearl Harbor.
I have to agree with you in the comments. You ask about how important was Pearl Harbor when I was 7 years old, and it was recent memory then. And if you look at
Right,
the last 10, 15 years, there was a big celebration when D-Day 50-year anniversary and 60-year anniversary. But as time goes on and the soldiers and sailors that were in D-Day are now gone, it's not mentioned as much anymore. Pearl Harbor's not mentioned as much anymore. And that
right.
doesn't mean that it's lost its importance. But I think, what you're saying about 9/11 and everything that came from that is Afghanistan and 20 years in Afghanistan and what happened, just in the recent months and what was many people will say was a mistake, in Iraq. And I've used a term before that history isn't history till it's history. I don't think that we can, it's 20 years since 9/11. I actually don't think there's enough time to put it all into perspective to really understand how it's changed our world.
Well,
We haven't seen the fruits of it, and some of those fruits are not. I mean, they might not be fruits; they might be funguses or something like that.
I completely agree with you on that last point that we're not far away enough from it to really look at it in an objective way. I would argue the reason why we can't do it is because 9/11 still isn't over.
Yeah, no, I would agree.
And in that case, like I think the trauma of Vietnam is still not over. Um, I think a lot of this boils down to us having to, and this gets to the dangers of brinksmanship that I think Picard is really worried about. Um, the cost of brinksmanship is ultimately, at some point, someone's going to have to pick up the gauntlet when it's thrown on the ground, and they're going to have to pick it up and smack you with it. Um, Whatever happens at the end of that smack is going to be a fight, and whatever happens at the end of that fight, someone's going to have to pay the real cost for it. And I think what we don't see on screen and what happens off screen during the Earth Romulan War and is probably a lot of people dying and suffering in ways that people don't want to repeat again. I think the reason why, and you said something interesting that people don't remember Pearl Harbor the way they used to because a certain generation died out. I think that we are always on the cusp of, here in America, of us forgetting huge generational events or losing a generation that experienced something that we desperately need to remember. And I say that because I look at our friends across the pond in Britain who take the memory of World War One and World War Two very seriously still. Even their younger generations understand, I didn't fight in this war, and my dad didn't fight in this war, and even my grandfather didn't fight in this war, but my great grandfather fought in this war, and like I'm lucky to be here because that great grandfather was a child of, was from a family of six children, and he was the only one that lived. The Europeans still have, from the ones that I talked to, an appreciation for like, my family may not have been here because
Well,
they didn't survive World War One or World War Two.
this is important because even if you use a term, you don't think that we've gotten through the trauma of Vietnam. We sort of gotten through the trauma of World War II. But again, you have to keep history in mind and learn from it because, the things that we allegedly believed in and fought against are starting to resurface again, even in this country. And it which is
Well, I
of great concern, of course.
well, I think that we have to look at the causes of why those things are starting to rise because the reason they rose, I so ju- j- I know we've gone off on a tangent. I promise we will get back to the episode, but Dad and I love talking about this stuff. You know, I think you and I would both agree that the the impetus and what stimulated World War I is something that cannot happen again here because the way countries are set up and the way countries deal with each other would not bring about that kind of, everyone has to watch each other's back, so all of a sudden we all have to fight each other. That's what happened in Europe. Everyone had these deals either through marriages or economic or military agreements that, if this
Right.
person attacked, we're all going to attack, that's how we ended up in this gigantic mess of World War I in Europe. Um, World War II happened because people were economically made destitute and punished for the actions of those wealthy elite in World War I. Um, if you look at the story that keeps happening, at some point the wealthy elite cause a disaster. Um, the common people of a country are punished, and among those people that are punished for what the wealthy elite do, fascism rises up. And that fascism turns into a certain type of cultism, and that cultism sweeps through a nation, and then all of a sudden you have a totalitarian dictator who's hell bent on world conquest. I think what we see is, you say, we see this thing coming up again in Europe and now coming up here in the US. I think it's because we keep seeing the same things happening over and over again to cause them to rise up. Like the economic inequality that we see the world over is really causing people to take on really extreme opinions and viewpoints that I don't think that they would if they felt like they lived in a place of relative material and economic security. Um,
People in America aren't quitting their jobs because they're lazy or that they don't want to work.
okay, so um, before we jump back to the episode, you brought that up, and I wasn't going to bring it up, but you did. So you're here, Dad. Why do you think people are quitting? I know you just said the short version, but if you had a long version, why do you think people are quitting?
Um, a lot of it has to do with the pandemic, that with the lockdowns, with the being people being laid off and losing income, and then the government having to come in and subsidize people with
Hmm.
rent and things of that sort, so they didn't get evicted, and it caused people to then look at how they worked. Like, hey, we're forced to work at home. Maybe we can work at home, and then it just a whole reset. Like, you know, why am I doing this when in many cases, I mean, the whole thing of essential workers, like, people that work in grocery stores are essential workers, but they're still getting paid $11 an hour, which is not a living wage. And it just made it gave people the opportunity to sit back and say, you know, why am I doing this? I'm like a rat on a treadmill. And
Right.
now that there's this backup in supply chain, and there's I read an article today. There's like we're short 80,000 truck drivers in the United States. I think the Brits are
Hmm.
like 20,000 or something like that because of Brexit, and
Oh,
they can't have all these Polish truck drivers come over. And
the Brits are screwed.
yeah, the Brits are in trouble, and I just it causes what's happened is people have be able to sit back and say, why are we living the way we are? Is there a better way? And now that, there's demand for workers to come back, they're saying, well, I don't need to go back to that same shitty job that didn't pay that well. I'll just wait, or I'll quit and find something better. And, labor's got more, um, got more heft right now, leverage.
I agree with you on all your points. I think one thing that keeps getting lost in this conversation, and this will be the last part we say, and then we'll get back
Sure.
to the show and we'll wrap up the show too.
Right.
Um, I think one thing that people weren't taking into account is, and I think we're still not taking into account, and we're not going to fix this until it is taken into account. I think people were being underpaid.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I think all of these companies, and we know that all of these corporations were sitting on, millions, if not billions of dollars in just assets that they were paying out to their shareholders, or else they were just sitting on. Hell, you worked in the 501c3 sector for a long time, and how many of those non for profits are just sitting on money that they're not really spending?
I had a
Um,
conversation with somebody in a not for profit yesterday and said, we cannot keep making as much money as we do as a not for profit and do nothing with it.
right. Um, and there's something I'll tell you offline once we get there,
Sure.
but one thing that I think is happening is like the entire argument that we can only pay you so much, or this job isn't doesn't make enough, or you don't make enough that we can't cover you with health insurance. I
Right.
think one thing that the pandemic revealed is that that's all bullshit. Like
Oh,
you
you're absolutely,
you can pay
absolutely.
people a living wage, and you probably can afford to give them health insurance. What's been revealed is they simply don't want to.
It goes back to what we've talked about before, the shift that happened in the 80s, that
Right.
the emphasis became totally more focused on return of investment to the shareholders, and the sort of social contract existed before then of working to pay workers a living wage went out the window. And
Right.
there's been a lot of pressure and discussion to move it in that back direction. And there's a lot of effort to do that, even with the progressive Democratic agenda.
Well, like one thing that I think the people who don't want to pay more and don't want to cover employees, I think the hard thing for them going forward is that they're going to realize, and I'm not just pulling this out of my ass. I really do think that this is happening. I think if you're going to be a successful business in the future, you have to run your business in such a way that not only do you make a profit and not only do you make a return to your shareholders, but a hallmark of your success is going to be your ability to pay your pay your employees a living wage and also provide them some sort of health care or some sort of health coverage. And that will be like, a basic rubric. It'll be a basic point on a rubric on whether or not you're a successful business or
And
not.
that and
This
that's
entire idea of like just
and that's
wasting human capital is gone.
that's not socialism. That's just putting things into balance.
Well, I think one thing that Card does, and this was finally segueing us back to the episode, when Jordy is able to finally alter the neutrino beam on the beacon so he can give the signal up to the ship that, we're here, beam us up. Picard and Tomalak have this standoff where they're basically going to fire all their weapons at each other. And Picard says, the only way I'm going to avoid a war today and save my engineer and save this Romulan is if I lower my shields and I take the leap of faith that Tom Locke is not going to fire on me if I tell him I'm coming to rescue your countrymen. Um, I think that one thing that this episode does is show that the way we get out of all of these problems, this brinksmanship, instead of turning towards trying to one up on each other or control our territories or maintain the status quo of our egos, we actually have to dip down into our humanity
Well, yes, and this is
and
I've got this
find a
image.
way to give something to each other that we don't trust each other to give ourselves
Well,
and or each other.
here's the thing: if these hypersonic weapons just are such a threat, It's like between Russia, the U.S., and China. It's like each one of them. Let's take the U.S. If we have hypersonic missiles, in our left hand, we're pointing them toward China, and our right hand, we're pointing them toward Russia. If you're Vladimir Putin, you're doing the same thing, except in your left hand, you're pointing them toward China, and your right hand, you're pointing to the United States. And Xi
Yeah.
Jinping is the same thing. And it's like, guys, this is stupid. You
Well, ultimately, the downfall of all this, brinksmanship is that it doesn't ever actually deal with the differences of ideas. It just ends up with the loss of
it's
life.
a game. That's the point I think
Right.
that I got. It's
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 a
a
game.
it's a game.
Well, it'd be one thing, getting back to kind of our conversation about the Cold War or even World War II, if this hadn't been a game of lives lost, if it had been like, and I know people are going to say, "Well, Jay, that sounds mad," but let's imagine we fought world wars with philosophers, and like instead of Hitler sending armies across the channel to bomb the shit out of London, like he and Churchill have to meet in New York and actually debate British parliamentarianism versus Hitler's ideas. Well, I think that's kind of what I think everyone hopes we would end up doing rather than the sort of brinksmanship where people die. But it seems like this brinksmanship is such a common course for the world. And I have to ask you, from what you've seen in your life, just the course of human events, why do you think that we in 2021 are still playing these sorts of games with each other? You've mentioned China and Russia and the US and hypersonic missiles, and we've talked about economies and military budgets. Why do you think we're still doing this brinksmanship with each other when we know what the cost of it is? Like, we know there's mutually assured destruction. We know that it doesn't help our economies, and we know that it costs human lives. Why do you think we keep doing this? And this will be the last thing we
I mean,
will ask to end
there's
the
cultural
episode.
differences in how different cultures or countries look at the future, because we know that Western countries are strategically are more short term. As you look at the Japanese and the Chinese,
Hmm.
they really do look at 100, 200 years. But I think human nature is we get sucked into, whether you're Chinese, American, or Russian or British, is you have to deal with the problems of now.
Hmm.
And then, but you know that there's looming larger problems out there, such as climate change, which is related to energy supply and so forth.
Right.
And, but you can't, it's so difficult because of sort of, particularly now with the politics, and the politics is driven by our access to just an overabundance of information that we cannot,
Hmm.
we just focus on the now and then can't make the shift related is some of the decisions we have to make now just aren't about today or next week. They have to be put in context as to where you want to be 10, 20, 30 years from now. I mean, at
Oh,
least you've
even
got,
100.
yeah, I mean, at least you've got some of the automobile companies aggressively moving toward
Hmm.
electric vehicles. Ford, Volkswagen. I heard about Rivian, this company in Kansas City who makes the pickup trucks that Bezos drove Shatner out to the Blue Origin rocket in. They mentioned these trucks are really
Yeah.
cool. I said, what the hell are Rivians? And then I read about it. I said, oh, okay.
So, I think that you bring up a lot of good points about there being culture. The viewpoint of like, we all do have, I think, commonalities, but we do have very big differences in terms of where we think we all commonly end up. And I think the key point that we all keep missing in all this is it doesn't matter where we end up if the cost of it isn't worth it. Because, I think that we have to ask now, and you brought up Rivian because I think that's the electric truck, right?
That's the electric truck, yeah.
Yeah, and I want to say something about Shatner and Bezos before we go, but one thing that China's trying to do, and they're trying to commit themselves to, they're trying to go carbon neutral too. Not only because publicly and on an international level it looks good, but you know, climate change is really starting to wreck their really populated coastlines, and the ramifications of environmental shifts are going to hit them harder than it would actually hit us. So like there's a real motivation for them to actually adopt green energy quicker than not, and they've been doing a really good job in terms of like solar energy and attempting to large reforestation efforts. Now, when it comes to like countries like Russia and India and even Brazil, you know, you hit on the issue of energy. One thing that Star Trek doesn't really touch on, and we've touched on it previously in other episodes, but the issue of dilithium. Maybe there is a scarcity here that we're not seeing, but I
Right.
wonder if one of the reasons why we keep doing this brinksmanship is the fear of someone running out of a resource first and having to be the one to ask for help. Because one thing, what brought the Klingons to heel in Undiscovered Country?
They needed a new home planet. Kronos was going to be destroyed,
No,
right?
no, no. Kronos was fine. Praxis exploded.
Oh,
Praxis
which
was
was
their main energy
energy.
facility.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. Right.
That's right.
Practice.
The
Yeah.
The Klingons only had 50 years of energy left, so they
Right.
decided to end their war with the Federation.
Right. That's right.
And the reason why they tried to they assassinated Chancellor Gorkon and then tried to assassinate the Federation president is because there were warmongers who were still making money and getting power off the war, including those in the Federation.
Hmm.
So, like, there was this chance in Undiscovered Country to, lower your shields and beam up the survivors and really start trying to put together something, and people didn't want to do that because they were going to lose something out of that. Um, and I think there's one. I'm going to close on this because you brought up Bezos and Shatner. So, as everyone knows, and this may be a weird segue, but it's connecting to this idea of like lowering our shields and giving each other into our humanity. Um, so you know, Bezos recently took Shatner up in the recent Blue Horizon launch, and Shatner apparently had the overview effect. And for those at home, the overview effect is something that happens within astronauts or people who've traveled to suborbital or orbital heights, where you actually see the difference between the Earth in space, and not just like the great big blue ball of Earth and like the sky space, but you see the barrier and the differences and the limits. And Shatner apparently saw life in the blue, our blue living planet, and then saw the death of what lies beyond. And when he came back down, I'm going to start crying because it's Bill Shatner. Um, you know, Captain Kirk finally understood everything that he had been talking about in those stories. And Jeff Bezos just wanted to come up to him and, you know, have a bottle of champagne. I think for the majority of us, I think most of us, if we are forced in the situation, we would experience the overlooked effect, or we would end up being like Geordie LaForge and Centurion Bakra, where we would experience something together that we would come together and unify on, with the understanding that what we have here is really sacred and really important, and it's important to put aside our egos and put aside our fears and put aside kind of our ideas of superiority, or this notion that we need to keep up our sense of selves, next to the requirement of just doing the right thing and trying to keep people alive. I think Shatner saw that when he went up in the Blue Horizon and came back down. I don't think Jeff Bezos can see that. And I think when you saw Shatner have this experience and Bezos not have that experience, I think I want people at home listening to this to really pay attention to this, because I think that we are facing a situation now where a lot of us in this world are Picards and Tomalaks, where we're scared of the situation we're being put into, and we all feel like we have a side that we have to defend. But the only way we're going to get out of this is if we decide to look at our common humanity and the things that we share, and decide to put that above, like I said beforehand, our petty status quos and egos. The people that we really have to worry about are the Jeff Bezoses, who, in the midst of us trying to figure out our petty egos and end our squabbles, are more concerned about popping bottles of champagne. It's the
I'll,
people who pop bottles of champagne that will want to keep the wars going.
if I can end, our podcast,
Absolutely.
I agree. Shatner had a genuine life-changing experience at age 90.
Right.
Bezos was sitting there looking at it. God damn, Bill, this is the best advertisement for Blue Origin I could ever imagine.
Right.
You could see it on his face.
Right. And
Bastard.
thankfully I don't. Right. And thankfully I don't think Bill was. I think Bill went beyond that.
He did. He was beyond it.
So,
yeah.
Dad, thank you very much for joining me again for a wild and
Yes.
roundabout episode.
Yes. Right.
But thank you, everyone. We will be back
Thank
next
you.
time for Star Trek: The Next Generation, Season 3, Episode 8, The Price. See you then. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Night.